It is early morning. Mist rises from the marshes, but the heat of the day has not yet begun. On the high citadel ramparts, exhausted defenders are changing the guard. They look out across the ruined expanse of occupied Rome, reddened by blood and the rising sun. The smell of death mixes with the smoke from smoldering campfires and charred buildings. All, finally, is quiet. It is in stark contrast to the noise and confusion of the night before, when drunken barbarians slaughtered their way through the broken veins of the Eternal City. The horrified cries of their victims floated on the night air to those on duty behind this last bastion of defense, perched on Capitoline Hill. The walls had been breached. Rome had been sacked. The invading Gauls are already awakening when Gaius Fabius Dorsuo, severe and stoic, discards his helmet and breastplate. Slowly and with purpose, he covers his bare chest with a heavy, cumbersome toga, the traditional costume of his kinsmen and ancestors. He tucks the fold of the garment into a restraining waistband. Tradition demands he must do so when making a sacrifice, and the sacred duty he's about to perform will require unrestricted movement. Then, with a final few words to his armored colleagues, he clambers over the well-manned defenses and climbs carefully down onto the rubble-strewn street beyond. For a moment, both the defenders and the watching enemy are stunned into silence as his single figure resolutely steps forward into the ruined streets. Curious Gallic warriors block his route down from the citadel, but as the Roman approaches, they merely part to let him pass. The jeering and mocking enemy withdraw at his approach, but they do not attack. Perhaps they think this is another trick or a final desperate ploy by his beleaguered soldiers on the Capitoline Hill. Will the Romans come down to die, one by one? But Gaius Dorsuo has a duty to perform, and he will not be deterred. With stoic resolve, he makes his way through the threats and shouts of Gallic warriors, through the debris-strewn streets to the place of sacrifice. His colleagues watch from the many makeshift barriers and defenses of the hill. Dorsuo walks on. He might fail his city, but he will not fail his ancestors or his gods. For the Romans know that this is not the first time that their bloodlines have faced destruction or displacement. For hadn't the Trojan hero Aeneas, favoured by the goddess Venus, escaped the burning city of Troy with a few brave individuals, escaping to establish the Roman race on Italian soil? Hadn't the city founded by his descendants faced crisis after crisis, from brutal kings to bruising neighbours as the Republic dawned? Hadn't hero after hero risen from the people to defend their land and set down an example for centuries to come? This is that story. The story of what a small, resolute community in a rural region of Italy believed to be their earliest origins, expressed through folktales, morals and myths. What were the tales told by its legions around campfires on the eve of battle? What legends did Roman children hear to quieten them at bedtime during times of civic struggle? This narrative emerges from the most ancient classical accounts, from legends of heroic Bronze Age civilizations in the 2nd millennium BC, to verifiable historical records 1,000 years later. This is an account of ancient Rome, its authentic origins, and its enshrouding myths. This is the story of how Rome began. A small force which is highly trained in the conflicts of war is more apt to victory. A raw and untrained horde is always exposed to slaughter, and the long history of Rome's interactions with its neighbours hammer home this point. Wars are won by the prepared. This video has been sponsored by War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game out there, and one that transports you back in time to battles raging from the 1920s to the present day, with a choice of more than 2,500 super-detailed tanks, planes, helicopters and ships from 10 different nations. Immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. You can join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles and delve into the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. There's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. So join me for free on PC, Xbox or PlayStation by following the link in the description, and new and returning players that haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions and 7 days of premium account, for a limited time only. Troy is burning. The city has fallen. The alarm is sounding through the streets and houses. The cry rings out. The Greeks are back. The sacrificial horse is on fire. It disgorges warriors into the night. We must flee. Children are roused from sleep by terrified mothers. The elderly bundle their few possessions together and stumble into alleyways. Chaos is everywhere. The city gates are open and enemy soldiers are rushing through, looting and killing as they come. Their final destination is the palace of King Priam. They will slaughter the royal family in revenge for harboring Helen, the adulterous wife of the Greek king Menelaus. The fighting is fierce, as defenders woken from slumber try to block the narrow streets in a desperate attempt to halt the onslaught. But one man is being protected by the gods. He gathers his family and prepares to leave the city. His name is Aeneas, and he knows the only possible escape route is towards the breach in the city walls. The thickening air is filled with cries of terror, yells of alarm and the brutal shouts of triumph from Greek swordsmen, and as a background to it all, the dull thump of falling masonry and the crackle and spit of flames. Finally, the small group of citizens stumble over collapsed stonework out into the starlight on the dark side of the hill. Aeneas pauses for breath, only to realize that his wife is no longer with them. Setting down his father, but still gripping his son by the arm, he searches the fearful faces of those following him as they stagger away from the city. He calls her name, but she is gone. Yet this story is not an account of Troy or Greece. This is the legend of how Rome began. The earliest, most ancient narratives from the classical world survive as epic verses attributed to the Greek poet Homer. Homer emerges from the space between legend and history sometime in the 8th century BC, as an aged and blind poet writing more than 400 years after the events he recounts. His epic narratives tell how the city of Troy, on the western coast of Anatolia, was besieged by a great military coalition of Mycenaean Greeks. It's a story of heroic Bronze Age combat in a time when it was believed that the gods freely engaged in the affairs of mortals. Archaeologists connect this Homeric account with the Bronze Age site of Hisarlik in modern Turkey. Excavation has revealed the remains of close-set, dry stone urban walls, all with a destructive layer of scorched residue. Scientific analysis of this material revealed that a hostile force had sacked and burned the city in the 1180s BC. Was this the remote event that inspired the greatest legend of classical culture? But the excavated site of Hisarlik is a meager place compared to the magnificent, sprawling city described in Greek poetry, a narrative that abounds with epic battles, contests, and intrigues. Wherever this place was, the Greeks recalled and recounted the fortunes and fate of Troy long after its destruction. Greek legends recall how the Trojans were betrayed by their piety and impulsive devotion. Believing the Greeks had finally abandoned their decade-long war and departed, they dragged a sacred gift offering left by their enemies, a giant wooden effigy of a horse, within their walls. Homer recalls the conflict in the Iliad. At last, what fate decreed was done, that the city of Troy would be destroyed. They hauled the wooden horse within their walls. The bard sang of how the sons of Greece issued forth from the womb of that deceitful horse, and they divided to destroy Ilium and ravage the city with a purpose as terrible as that of Ares. But the hero Aeneas was being watched over by his divine mother Aphrodite, for after their escape from the city, these few survivors reached ships that took them overseas to distant lands, where their enemies could not follow. And it is here that the Greek legend ends and the Roman narrative begins. The Romans believed that Aeneas fled westward with his small cadre of followers. These Trojan fugitives crossed a few thousand miles of sea to eventually settle in a remote, wild, and sparsely populated region on the west coast of Italy. Once there, they first warred with, then intermarried among, the native Latium people. Together, they formed a new community, the ancestral stock that would one day establish the city of Rome on the nearby Tiber River. However, few archaeological remains exist from this distant era, though genetic testing of ancient skeletal remains can reveal the true origins and character of the earliest Italian populations. Though ancient accounts emphasize the identity of many regional groups who produced unique cultures and distinctive artifacts, on a genetic level, it seems that there was little difference between Latins, Sabines, Samnites, and even most Etruscans. By 1000 BC, the Bronze Age populations of central Italy were fully indigenous and had occupied this region for more than a millennium. But there is one distinct movement of people into Bronze Age Italy that is clearly discernible from ancient traditions, archaeological remains, and genetic legacies. In around 800 BC, large groups of Greek settlers from the eastern Mediterranean established communities on the island of Sicily and coastal sites in southern Italy. They came in search of resources, trading opportunities, and new agricultural lands. This incoming population would have had a significant impact on the identity, culture, and genetics of the region, and at that date, they would have been familiar with and retold Greek myths, including that of Troy. Though the site of ancient Rome was well chosen for an early settlement, the topography of the landscape encouraged odd settlement patterns that are difficult to identify in the archaeological record. The landscape was uneven, encompassing 7 hills on which separate defensive settlements could be established. The valleys between the high ground contained marshy stretches of land that made the area more defensible, but hampered any early expansion of the hillside settlements. The river Tiber also facilitated the movement of goods from inland sources and provided a connection to seaborne traffic on the nearby coast. The local tufa supplied a good building stone, while clay deposits close to the Palatine and Capitoline hills furnished brickworks. Salt production was also possible downriver. The current evidence suggests the presence of at least 3 Bronze Age settlements at the site that would become Rome. A few fragments of pottery dating to the Middle Bronze Age, 1500 BC, have been found on the Capitoline Hill and in the valley below. Finds of pottery from the Late Bronze Age, about 1000 BC, are more common, with shards uncovered during excavations in the Forum and on the Palatine and Capitoline Hills. Indeed, the earliest Roman traditions do recognize their origins as an amalgamation of separate communities. According to Livy, the Capitoline Hill was settled by the Sabines, the Palatine Hill received its name from Greek immigrants from Arcadia, while other incomers owned residences near the Aventine. The scarce remains from surviving archaeology cannot confirm these traditions, but there is evidence that inhabitants of early Rome had a shared identity. A grave offering dating to around 630 BC from Tarquinia, just north of Rome, was inscribed with the name Rutilius Hippocrates. This attests to the existence of a man with a Latin first name and Greek second name that had been Etruscanized. It seems early Rome existed at an interface between cultures. But in the 20s BC, at the onset of the imperial era, a court poet named Virgil rewrote and reimagined the Roman foundation myth. Virgil wanted to bolster the propagandist power and political claims of the first emperor Augustus. His epic work, the Aeneid, superseded and eclipsed many previous founding myths of the old Roman Republic. Indeed, the work was so successful that it's now difficult to recover the authentic beliefs of previous generations. Did earlier Romans have a choice of protectors and origin myths? Did the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 387 BC amplify or alter their legend of Aeneas of Troy? Later chronicles claim that 4 centuries had elapsed between the arrival of the Trojan hero in Italy and the establishment of Rome. Every Roman knew the story. Aeneas formed an alliance with the Latiums to merge Trojan and Italian identities, but it was his son who established Alba Longa, the main urban settlement of this new community. Alba Longa was in the Alban Hills, 12 miles southeast of where the city of Rome would one day stand. For 400 years, Alba Longa was the leading center of royal power in the region. It oversaw a territorial network of small, localized villages until the rightful king Numitor was deposed and ousted by his brother Amulius. Amulius murdered his brother's sons and compelled Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal priestess, ensuring she would never produce heirs. Somehow, Rhea became pregnant with twin boys, said to be fathered by Mars, the god of war, and when Amulius learned of this union, he ordered the offspring to be killed by drowning. However, the Tiber River had overflowed its banks, so the servants abandoned the newborn babies, exposing them to the elements beneath a fig tree at the base of the Palatine Hill. The rain has finally stopped. The floodwaters of the Tiber are beginning to recede, but still lie puddled in muddy depressions. Under a grey sky beneath the sparse trees, a man clambers slowly around the boulders off the hillside. He's poorly clothed and supports his weight upon a shepherd's staff, searching for something in the soft mud. Suddenly, he stiffens and crouches down. Wolf tracks. Could they be from the great she-wolf that has been spotted nearby? He continues to trail the wolf, seeking the path of the predator, but in the next instant he freezes as he hears a low growl. He looks up. There she is. The she-wolf's muzzle is pulled back, furrowed to reveal 2 long fangs. She growls again as the man slowly draws a small knife from his girdle. It seems down to him alone to stand between this fearsome creature and the flocks on the bare hillside. He flexes his arm and raises the knife. But the wolf is watching and suddenly springs down to land about 6 feet in front of him. The creature sniffs the air and lowers her great head to gaze at the man with a penetrating stare. Then she turns away. But after a few paces, she stops and looks back, her yellow eyes compelling him to follow her. He sheathes his knife and does so. She stops below a high grassy bank with a small cave about halfway up its slope. From the darkness comes the cries of human children. The old shepherd gasps in astonishment and begins to climb, but the wolf has gone. Legend says this common herdsman was called Faustulus, and he and his wife, Acca Laurentia, raised the semi-divine infants as their own sons, naming them Romulus and Remus. As youths, the twins defended the shepherds and hillfolk from the attacks of their oppressive uncle, King Amulius, but fate led them back to Numitor, their wronged grandfather. Together they gathered a following to ambush and overcome Amulius and restore Numitor to the throne of Alba Longa. But when they had reinstated Numitor, the 2 young princes set out to establish their own city. As they approached the hills overlooking the Tiber, they sought out the place they could have been discovered as infants, but the twins could not agree. Narratives vary, but it is said that Romulus began ceremonies to consecrate a settlement site surrounding the Capitoline Hill. He performed solemn rites and traced the sacred perimeter of the new settlement. But Remus interrupted and jeeringly leapt over the incomplete barrier. Romulus responded. Livy records. The commoner story is that Remus leapt over the new perimeter in mockery of his brother, whereupon Romulus, in great anger, slew him, adding these menacing words, "So perish whoever else shall leap over my walls." Thus, Romulus acquired sole power, and the city that was founded was called by his name, Rome. But what lies behind this legend? Had the sacred rites to preserve the city's perimeter been interrupted or violated by some impious act? Perhaps the expanse of Rome had not been successfully secured. Roman power would ultimately have no limits, but their ancient city would always be vulnerable to incursion by hostile forces. Nevertheless, tradition forever claimed that Rome was founded on fraternal bloodshed, on a date fixed in later Roman calendars as the 21st of April. Romulus became king and selected 100 men to form his Senate. This was a special advisory body, a new oligarchy, whose descendants would become the patricians. Then, to swell the population, the new king promised that all who came to the settlement would be made welcome. He invited fugitives, adventurers, and displaced freemen to join his fledgling community. The city grew from these settlers, merging with the population of Latium. Archaeology does not provide evidence for a significant urban site in the Alban Hills that matches the description of Alba Longa, but Rome is a different matter. Though several millennia of construction, rebuilding, and restoration has disturbed or obliterated most of the fragile foundation remains. These remains increase during the era of Romulus, but they could suggest a different origin for the classical city. Perhaps several villages developed on surrounding hillsides, and over time these rural clusters coalesced into the urban core of early Rome. Remains from the 700s BC have been found at Kermelus, part of the Palatine Hill. They are a collection of small oval and square huts. Nearby is a wedge-shaped building, interpreted as the first Regia, royal residence of Rome. This substantial building was modified and extended at least 3 times in the 600s BC before being adorned with painted terracotta moldings in the Etruscan style. It was clearly a building of significance. According to legend, Romulus, the first king of Rome, remained a military warlord. The oldest legal, political, religious, and social institutions preserved by Rome were therefore traced back to him as their venerated founder, and Romulus lived well into old age, with his demise the stuff of legend. Livy writes, "A violent thunderstorm suddenly arose and enveloped the king in so dense a cloud that the gathering lost sight of him, and from that moment Romulus was never seen again. For when the fearful weather cleared and bright sunlight fell upon the royal seat, it was vacant. Some senators had been standing close by, and they claimed that the king had been snatched up to heaven by a whirlwind. This was believed by many spectators, who were rendered speechless by fear and grief. Then a few speakers began shouting their approval. All those who were present began hailing Romulus as a god, the son of a god, the king and father of the city of Rome. But other dim and distorted traditions exist, and they hint that Romulus was secretly killed and dismembered by the senators. So the fate of Romulus was therefore believed to be a magnificent ascendancy to the pantheon of the gods, or a brutal death by conspiracy. This would foreshadow future assassinations and regicides in the long and troubled history of Rome. But again, what of archaeology? Throughout antiquity, the Romans maintained a special shrine on the Capitoline Hill. It was a simple hut, said to be the first dwelling erected on the site. Known as the House of Romulus, it was carefully restored and rebuilt as it weathered through the ages. And in the 1930s, archaeologists excavating among the brick and marble remains of the Capitoline Hill uncovered post holes belonging to a simple wooden hut. Could this have been the building that was the nucleus of Rome, or at least the spot venerated by the ancients? Headlines proclaim the discovery of the hut of Romulus, but this is difficult to verify. Later Roman traditions also venerated something they called the Lupercal Cave. This was a crevice where the Lupa, the female wolf, was said to have preserved and protected the divine twins. The precise location of the Lupercal was lost in late antiquity when Roman emperors converted to Christianity and the sacred chamber was permanently sealed. But in January 2007, an Italian archaeologist named Irene Lacopi made an extraordinary announcement. Her team had been investigating ways to preserve the foundations of the emperor's sprawling palace on the Palatine Hill. They were surveying the remains of the Domus Livia, a northwest section of the imperial residence where public business was conducted. There, within the crumbling remains, the team uncovered something unexpected, an anomaly in the bedrock of the site. There was a fissure in the deep foundations extending downwards far below the surface, leading into an enigmatic cavity. Carefully releasing a camera probe into the crevice, there in the depths, 45 feet below, they discovered a vaulted chamber, entirely sealed and untouched since ancient times. Despite the media headlines, most archaeologists believe that the recently discovered chamber is probably a grotto involved in some other secretive and solemn rites, not the Lupercal cave. But its presence does hint at the existence of other underground chambers, still undiscovered and intact, beneath the imperial center. But even something as iconic as the she-wolf motif might have had its origins in other traditions. Early depictions of a she-wolf in Etruscan art suggest that the Romans borrowed or shared narratives with their northern neighbors. In Bologna, an Etruscan stele from the 400s BC preserves the depiction of a single infant being suckled by a she-wolf, and a bronze mirror from Bolsena carries an even more remarkable image. This was an Etruscan object from the 300s BC and possibly a bridal gift. It depicts a she-wolf with human twins, next to a shepherd and several deities. Perhaps this indicates the Romans borrowed the Romulan motif from Etruscan legends and placed their founder in an older tradition. It was said that Romulus was the first of 7 successive Roman kings. Later traditions present each subsequent king with a unique character and ascribe certain innovations to them to reflect their specific incentives and interests. Consequently, early Roman narratives are often dismissed as morality tales and not genuine history. Many academics believe these accounts were later attempts to make sense of an archaic mishmash of poorly recalled or partially understood developments. Indeed, the later Romans believed that they had been subject to kings for almost 200 years, granting each of the 7 kings an extraordinarily long reign. So perhaps there are some forgotten characters in the sequence. Or perhaps the early chronology was artificially lengthened to extend Roman traditions further back into the remote past. It is said that the kings of early Rome were elected monarchs, chosen by popular acclaim rather than by dynastic descent. In the 600s BC, the warlike Tullus Hostilius began a conflict with the mother city Alba Longa. The first battle was decided by a champion contest, with 2 sets of cousins, each triplets from the opposing cities, meeting in the space between the onlooking armies. The Horatii were fighting for Rome, Livy records. After performing their religious rites, the Romans and Albans laid aside their weapons and came out in front of their camps to be spectators for the combat. All of them were armed in the most splendid fashion and dressed like men about to die. When they came near, they gave their swords to their armor-bearers. They ran to one another and embraced, weeping and calling each other by affectionate names. The 2 opposing armies watched the armored champions from a great distance. This combat would decide the outcome of the conflict, the issue of supremacy, and perhaps even the fate of the 2 great cities. For long and tense moments, the 6 soldiers seemed evenly matched. For weren't Rome and Alba Longa a kindred community with shared heritage and nobility? But to the horror and dismay of the watching Roman army, their champion, Publius Horatius, suddenly turned and began to flee. But what seemed like fear was a tactic, and the 2 armies watched as the Roman turned to kill in sequence his exhausted pursuers. The surviving Roman had held on to his courage and preserved his strength. He had chosen to outwit his opponents, a very Roman trait. King Tullus gained supremacy over Alba Longa, and later, when the mother city had treacherously conspired against Rome, he ordered its annihilation. The population of Alba Longa was absorbed into the expanding Roman domain, and once again, the foundation of Rome returns to the theme of brutality, then amalgamation. But we've only explored these legends from within the flourishing city of Rome. What evidence is there for the rise of the city? from outside sources. In the 6th century BC, Greeks from Phocaea sail along the coast of central Italy with an ambitious destination in mind. They are leaving their home on the western edge of Anatolia, where the powerful Persian Empire is extending its rule across Western Asia, and will soon incorporate the cluster of Greek cities on the Aegean coast. And so to escape foreign domination, they plan to leave their ancestral city and establish a new community overseas. A citizen named Protis and his colleague Simos are appointed leaders of the expedition. They must navigate unfamiliar coasts towards a possible site for colonization on the southern coast of Celtica, ancient France. Celtica is an unknown region occupied by tribal people related to the barbarous Celts, so the Phocaeans will need new help on this distant venture. When the estuary of the Tiber River lies ahead, they proceed with caution. They will seek potential allies here. At the edge of their known world, the Phocaean leaders meet a representative of a local ruler who calls himself the Rex Romae, the king of Rome. His domain is centered on a small city-state upstream on the river. This is the first significant meeting between Greeks and the Roman state. Perhaps this is where the story of Rome will transition from myth and legend into history. But what can actually be attested about the first Romans? Early Rome and the surrounding Latin communities were on the frontier between the Etruscan city-states to the north and the long-established coastal Greek colonies to the south. The Romans therefore existed between two different cultures and civilizations, absorbing and adapting elements of each. The Roman toga came from the Etruscans, and much of the Roman pantheon seems to have been adapted from the Greeks, created by a cultural amalgamation with their gods. The early Greeks recognized these connections and offered intriguing explanations for parallel beliefs and customs. And centuries later, these same narratives were used to vindicate Roman expansion into Hellenic territories and their eventual conquest of Greece. Later Greeks preserved myths and traditions connecting Greece to Italy through characters in the Iliad. Other Greek legends connected Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, with several early Greek sites in southern Italy. A Greek author named Dionysius reviewed these legends when writing a history of Rome in the 1st century BC. He read old, respected accounts written by Greek historians in the 400s BC. Dionysius records, that author writes that Aeneas sailed to Italy from the land of the Molossians, western Greece. He came with Odysseus and became the founder of a city, which he named after one of the Trojan women, called Rome. Later writers formed their own narratives to explain similarities between Roman traditions and early Greek customs. The Romans were warlike, so could there be a connection to Sparta? Writing in the 1st century AD, Plutarch suggested that King Numa had been influenced by a Spartan athlete named Pythagoras. Plutarch writes, a Spartan named Pythagoras was the Olympic victor in the foot race for the 16th Olympiad. This contest occurred in the 3rd year in which Numa was king of Rome. This Pythagoras later travelled around Italy, where he made the acquaintance of Numa and helped him arrange the government of the city. Consequently, many Spartan customs were mingled with the Roman tradition as Pythagoras taught these concepts to Numa. This was the narrative favoured by many Greeks. In this retelling, it was the competitive martial element of Greece that had inspired Rome and set it on the path to world domination. By the 5th century BC, there were more than 30 major Greek cities around Sicily and the southern coast of Italy. Due to these prosperous and influential communities, this region became known as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. The closest Greek cities to Rome were Capua and Neapolis, only 130 miles south by road or 2 days sailing. Dionysius even places a Greek community in early Rome. By the 1st century BC, the historical Greek influences on Rome would have been evident throughout the city. Indeed, Dionysius invoked distant legends to assert, "Let my reader dismiss the views of those who called Rome a refuge of barbarians, fugitives, and brigands. Let him confidently affirm this to be a Greek city, the most welcoming of all places. For the native Enotrians were joined by Arcadians and then by Pelasgians, who are related to the Argives. Then the people of Thessaly came, with Evander and the Arcadians, who settled around the Palatine Hill. Then the Peloponnesians came with Hercules and settled upon the Saturnian Hill. They were joined by those who left the Troad and intermixed with the earlier settlers. So you will find no community that is more ancient or more Greek than Rome." Archaeology confirms that the Greeks had a strong presence in southern Italy during the 700s BC, the era attributed to Romulus and the founding of Rome. But it wasn't just Greeks. There were other communities influencing the development, culture, and composition of early Rome. According to Roman traditions, a 6th century king of Rome was a man of Etruscan descent named Servius Tullius, who seized power in about 578 BC. But the Etruscan accounts offer a very different version. They describe Tullius as the companion of 2 Etruscan warlords, known as the Vibena brothers. This alternative tradition was mentioned by the Emperor Claudius, who had studied antiquated Etruscan accounts of the distant past. Indeed, in an important speech, Claudius stated, "Servius Tullius was born to Acresia, a captive woman. But if we believe the Etruscans, he was a most faithful companion of Caelius Vibena and accompanied him in all his various adventures. He left Etruria with part of his army and settled in Rome on the Caelian Hill. He named this place after his leader, Caelius." And other remarkable evidence confirms the antiquity of this Etruscan tradition. A subterranean stone tomb was found near the ancient Etruscan city of Vulci in central Italy. The tomb, which dates to the 300s BC, belonged to a prominent Etruscan family called the Sates, who claimed descent from an ancestral figure named Vel Sates. One wall of the main chamber has a scene from the Iliad, while another shows combat between pairs of archaic warriors. The warriors are labelled with their names and in some cases their place of origin. This scene shows a skirmish between the Vibena brothers from Vulci and a group of rival warriors from Suana, Volsini, and Rome. The famous brothers are represented, Aulus and Caelius Vibena, along with Mastra, the future Servius Tullius. And so from Greeks to Etruscans, historical Rome emerges from a confusing and conflicting range of rival cultures and traditions. The era of kings was recalled in popular legends, but there was one tale worth retelling. It is the story of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, the 7th and last king of Rome. Reigning from 534 BC, Tarquin had aspirations to enlarge his Roman domains. Diplomatic efforts were increased to expand Roman interests beyond the existing frontiers, and preparations were underway for ambitious wars. He commissioned vast public works in the city to improve the infrastructure of Rome as a growing population center, but the citizens were compelled to labor underground on a monumental sewage system, and he expected the same citizens to provide infantry for his costly wars and aggressive expansion. Tarquin targeted the Roman aristocracy, the traditional leaders of the community. He saw them as the real threat, and as he consolidated power, he excluded, victimized, and even executed perceived opponents from the leading Roman families. But then, legend tells of a strange phenomenon that appeared in the household of the king. A pillar split and an ominous snake emerged. This was clearly a divine warning, and whatever it was, it directly concerned the royal family. But what did it mean? Full of foreboding, the fearful Tarquin sent 2 of his sons to Delphi, the leading cult center in ancient Greece. According to the story, Tarquin's sons were the first representatives of Rome to visit Delphi and consult its mysterious oracle. A man named Brutus accompanied them, the nephew of the king. On this mission, Brutus is dismissed as a harmless fool, but all is not as it seems. He is carefully withholding his true character to avoid persecution from his uncle, the arrogant Tarquin, and his overbearing sons. Livy explains, Tarquin sought answers from the world-famous Oracle of Delphi, but he was afraid to trust anyone else with the oracular response. He therefore sent 2 of his sons to Greece, and Titus and Aruns were joined by Lucius Junius Brutus. After completing their directive, the young men wanted to know which of them would succeed their father and receive the kingdom of Rome. A voice came from the lowest depths of the crevice. Whichever of you young men shall be the first to kiss his mother, he shall hold supreme power in Rome. The brothers drew lots to decide which of them should be the first to kiss their mother on the return to Rome. But Brutus understood that the oracular utterance had another meaning, so he pretended to stumble, and as he fell, he kissed the Roman ground. For this earth is the mother of us all. Lying collapsed in the city dirt, Brutus had the ambition to lead and a destiny that would change Rome forever. By 509 BC, popular uprisings were in progress across the Mediterranean. Athens was about to oust its last tyrant and install a proto-democracy where male citizens could determine the politics of the state. Did astute Brutus learn this on his journey through Greece? Did he wonder if Roman tyrants could be overthrown by a demagogue, a leader of the people? But the idea alone was not enough. It would take luck and a surge of popular outrage to bring down the tyranny of Tarquin the Proud. The provocation for action was yet another outrage conducted against a member of the aristocracy. While a nobleman named Collatinus was absent on campaign, Sextus Tarquinius, one of the king's sons, demanded hospitality at his homestead, and while he was there, he raped Collatinus's virtuous wife, Lucretia. Surviving narratives were written centuries after the events. They vary in detail and show the influence of many later retellings and traditions. Indeed, many display the impact of dramatic orations and performances in early Roman theatre. The virtuous Lucretia also became a tragic character in later stage plays, reimagining the dramatic origins of Republican Rome. Livy visualizes Lucretia summoning her husband Collatinus and her father Lucretius to the household where the crime occurred. Each man was instructed to bring a witness, so Brutus, nephew of the king, arrived as the trusted companion of Collatinus. Tradition recalls that the dishonored woman then plunged a dagger into her own chest before any of the astonished witnesses could intervene. Livy writes, "While the men were still occupied in their grief, Brutus pulled the knife from Lucretia's body. He held it up before them, all besmirched with her blood, and declared, 'By this blood most pure, and by this outrage of the king's son, I swear to you and to the gods to witness that I will uphold my oath. I will drive out Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, together with his cursed wife and his whole brood. I will not suffer them, or any other man, to reign in Rome.'" As crowds gathered in the Roman Forum, public grievances against the Tarquins were heard. Brutus used his position as tribune to summon the Curiae, an assembly of patricians who could devise and enact state laws. He spoke with elegance and passion and condemned the labor that Tarquin had forced upon the populace. He finally revealed his true intellect, confidence, and oratory. He called for the overbearing Tarquin to be dismissed from power and permanently banished from Rome. New magistrates were proposed and appointed by immediate election. The plebeians, the ordinary citizens, were summoned to an assembly in the Forum, where they approved the appointment of Collatinus and Brutus as consuls, two supreme magistrates. A subsequent vote sealed the fate of King Tarquin, as the newly appointed magistrates issued an immediate call to arms. When Tarquin learned of the uprising, he led his loyal troops back to the city, only to find the gates of Rome barred against him. A republican government was firmly established, with two consuls conducting the will of a patrician-filled senate. The powers of the exiled king were divided among various elected magistrates, all of whom were restricted to short, fixed-term offices. According to tradition, Brutus administered an oath before the people. He swore to never again tolerate a king in Rome and would kill anyone who attempted to restore the monarchy. But many younger members of the aristocracy were still attracted by the power, position, and wealth that a king could instantly grant them, and when a plot to restore Tarquin was uncovered, it actually involved Brutus's sons. Yet despite this, Brutus remained resolute. He fulfilled his sacred oath. Astonished crowds watched as the young men suffered a brutal public whipping before an execution by beheading. The message was clear. The good of the state was greater than the sentiments and honor of anyone. This obligation superseded even the duty of a father towards his sons. But Tarquin the Proud was not finished. He fled to nearby Etruria with his followers and encouraged the kings of various Etruscan cities to attack Rome to restore his royal position. Within a year, Brutus was killed at the Battle of Silva Arsia. He died opposing an Etruscan-backed army of the former king. According to tradition, Brutus was killed leading a cavalry charge in the first battle fought by the new republic. But the new political system functioned without fault, and a replacement second consul was chosen from a group of worthy candidates. As long as the oath of Brutus was honored, Rome would never again tolerate a king. Of course, as with much of early Rome's story, these accounts were written down long after the events they describe. As a result, the senators and magistrates in these narratives often behave like office holders, operating in a well-functioning republican system. Other ancient evidence suggests that state institutions were relatively weak in this era. In these archaic communities, powerful men might have operated more like warlords who agreed terms, rather than statesmen who obeyed legal frameworks. This could be depicted in the Tragliatella wine jug that was discovered at a site just north of Rome. The find, which dates to around 620 BC, depicts a group of armed men marching in formation as part of a ceremonial parade. They are all identically armed, with spears and a round shield painted with an emblem of a wild boar. By this period, Italic communities were beginning to adopt Greek forms of hoplite warfare and fought as heavily armored troops in organized ranks. At some stage, these powerful men might have used their warbands to challenge and oust ruling kings. Though by the 400s BC, these early fighting forces had developed into state militias, in which all male citizens who could afford armor and weapons were obliged to serve. And so perhaps the Republic began as an alliance of powerful men, institutionalizing their political status. But the kings were real in the traditions of Rome, and later Romans could view antique statues representing their ancient oppressive rulers. Pliny records that the oldest bronze statues in the city were on the Capitoline Hill, and these were the figures of the preceding kings. Dio Cassius describes the alarm and consternation that Julius Caesar caused when he set up a statue of himself next to these ancient autocrats. He states, "There were 8 of these statues. 7 depicted the kings and an 8th showed Brutus, who overthrew the Tarquins." And it would be another Brutus who ended the life of Caesar when he was accused of aspiring to kingship. The foundation myths of the Republic cast long shadows across Roman history. A mighty Etruscan army is advancing on Rome. Lars Porsena, the Etruscan king of nearby Clusium, leads the attack, summoned by banished King Tarquin, the former ruler of Rome. He intends to smash the fledgling Roman Republic and impose his own rule on the city, and he might even consider placing his associate Tarquin back in power. The fast-flowing river Tiber flanks Rome, but it possesses only one crossing point at this stretch. It is a narrow wooden bridge barely wide enough for a single wagon to pass along. Straight away, the invading Etruscans meet with success. They defeat and rout Roman forces gathering on the banks of the Tiber. The Roman defenders flee from the battle site in panic, abandoning all defensive positions. Giving in to fear and oblivious to duty, soldiers push each other out the way as they rush across the simple planking of the wooden bridge, seeking refuge behind the reassuring city walls of Rome. But one man understands the gravity of the situation. The Tiber is a formidable barrier. If the bridge remains in Roman hands, the Etruscan army will have to detour many miles to find an equivalent crossing. The defending Romans must hold this single objective, or else destroy it. This man holds on to his courage and decides to act. He is a low-ranking officer in the Roman army, and his name is Publius Horatius Cocles. As his fellow Roman soldiers stumble back across the bridge, Publius Horatius turns to face the enemy. He draws his sword and steps forward. Livy writes, Horatius was the bulwark of defense on which the entire fortune and future of the city of Rome depended. He saw the enemy charge down from the Janiculum hill. Meanwhile, his own people behaved like a frightened mob, throwing down their weapons and quitting their ranks. From the high walls of Rome, the helpless populace had watched in horror as their defenders threw down their weapons and fled. Now, the first ranks of the enemy reached the abandoned wooden crossing point. And in that moment, Horatius strides forward onto the bridge, takes up his position and makes his stand. He calls upon two veteran colleagues, Herminius and Lartius, to help him block the route across the narrow wooden walkway. They resolutely obey and stand on either side of the young commander, gripping their swords and shields. The Roman champions stand ready for a contest that to many must have seemed hopeless. The first sacrifice of men on behalf of a new republic. But clad in their protective bronze armor, these three champions of Rome become formidable opponents on that confined walkway. The enemy cannot overwhelm and surround them with sheer force of numbers due to the narrowness of the crossing. Every moment matters, for as the champions stand firm, their comrades suddenly turn back and regroup. They realize the tactic has bought them time, and they can destroy the crossing if the three men can hold back the fury of the oncoming enemy army, even for a short time. They begin to hack frantically at the woodwork structures of the bridge. Livy recalls the legend. Horatius commanded them to break down the bridge with steel, with fire, with any instrument at hand. He vowed that he alone would receive the onrushing enemy. Then he strode onto the bridge. He was an obvious target amid his timid comrades. Horatius drew his sword, covered his body with his shield, and prepared to do battle at close quarters. When the first rush of the enemy comes, the three valiant defenders successfully withstand the onslaught. But when Lartius and Herminius view the collapsing structure behind them, they withdraw from the tottering, collapsing bridge. Horatius is left standing alone. Undeterred, he cries out challenges to the Etruscan nobles. When they realize that the platform behind Horatius is collapsing and the crossing will soon be gone, the Etruscans make a final desperate charge. Livy describes the crash of the falling bridge and the cheers which burst from the throats of the Romans, but then their sudden exuberance becomes a cry of dismay as they realize the fate of Horatius. Still clad in heavy bronze battle armor, Horatius utters an urgent prayer. O Father Tiber, I solemnly invoke thee, receive these weapons and this soldier within your fortunate stream. It is a cry of sacrifice as he leaps straight into the turbulent waters of the fast-flowing river. The last champion of Rome disappears from view as a final volley of enemy javelins punches the surface of the water. And then, according to Roman legend, Horatius was miraculously uninjured from his great ordeal. Still encased in armor, his body broke to the surface and he swam back to his grateful comrades on the far bank. The exhausted hero was conducted into the city by a chanting crowd. Horatius was praised and heaped with honors and awards. But in later eras, even the most patriotic Romans had doubts about this legend. Indeed, Florus comments, If these deeds were not recorded in our annals, then the characters would seem altogether fabulous, especially compared with current achievements. Livy also offers some skepticism over Horatius when he comments, "Over time, this story of valor was destined to become more famous than it is credible." But the Greeks told a harsher story. Polybius has Horatius die defending the collapsing bridge. However, foreign commentators clearly understood the Roman message preserved within the legend. Polybius records, "Horatius deliberately sacrificed his life because he valued the safety of his homeland. His own future reputation mattered to him more highly than his present life, or even all the years of existence remaining to him. This is how Roman customs encouraged their populace to desire and emulate noble deeds." It was said that a statue of Horatius Cocles was erected in the Comitium, the large open place in the Forum where the citizen assemblies were held. It served as a prominent example of duty, and all Roman citizens called to that place to decide the action of state did so under his image. By the imperial era, the heavily eroded statue standing on the slope of the Capitoline was barely recognizable. Nevertheless, Pliny believed the myth of Horatius and records, "This man single-handedly prevented the enemy from crossing the Sublician bridge, and his statue remains standing to this day." Archaeology cannot confirm these legends, and even the appearance of early Rome is difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Evidence from later roadways confirms that there was indeed an ancient bridge near the foot of the Aventine Hill, but its foundations were swept away by river currents long ago. Later accounts confirm that the structure was wooden, and sacred processions took place along this route. On the Ides of May, a group, including the chief priest and Vestal virgins, visited the main shrines in the city before heading to a structure called the Sublicius Bridge. This was the Lemuria, an ancient purification ritual conducted on the site where Horatius had fought to safeguard the city. The men in this sacred company carried life-size straw effigies known as argi, which were cast into the Tiber as symbolic sacrifices. Perhaps, if the story is even partially true, King Porsena regarded the Roman defenders on the bridge as rare fanatics. But was he troubled by their challenges? Was he disturbed by their rhetoric, which condemned the rule of kings over self-governing citizens? Were the Romans really committed to their new citizen-based republic, or would they reluctantly accept Tarquin's return? After a minor delay and detour, Porsena prepared to blockade Rome. He encamped his formidable army outside the long city wall and waited. Despite Horatius's bravery, Rome was still besieged. A Roman youth named Mucius Cordus receives the approval of the Roman Senate for a bold deed. He will assassinate Lars Porsena. Mucius must cross the Tiber to infiltrate the Etruscan camp. The mission means certain death, but it could prematurely end the stalemate of the siege. Stealthily, Mucius conceals himself among the bustling activity of the enemy, awaiting his chance. Then, during a review of the Etruscan troops, Mucius bursts from hiding and strikes the target with his single blade. But he has killed the wrong man. He has mistaken a royal scribe for the king. Livy records, Gaius Mucius tried to force his way back through the dismayed crowd, still holding his blood-stained dagger, but the shouting caused a rush to the spot. He was seized by the king's bodyguard and dragged back to the royal tribunal. Here, alone and helpless and in the utmost peril, he was still able to inspire more fear than he felt. Gaius Mucius Cordus cries out, "Watch, so you know how cheap the body is to men who seek great glory." Then he plunged his right hand into a fire burning on the altar. He kept it roasting there as if he felt no sensation of pain. The next declaration made by the determined youth causes even greater concern. "I am Gaius Mucius, a citizen of Rome. I came here as an enemy to kill my enemy. I am as ready to die as I am to kill. We Romans act bravely, and when adversity strikes, we suffer bravely. I am not alone in having taken this resolution against you. There is a long list of those who aspire to the same distinction. Decide now if you want to fight for your life every day. You will fight against armed foes who will even enter your royal tent. For this is the war which we, the youth of Rome, have declared against you. You do not need to fear ranks of troops in pitched battle. This matter will be settled between you alone and a single one of us." The startled king could only reply, "Go then, for you are a worse enemy to yourself than to me." Porsena then releases the youth and allows him to return to Rome without further injury. According to this Roman account, the bravery of one quick-thinking youth saved the city. Gaius Mucius has instilled genuine fear in a single, crucial enemy. But maybe this legend obscures a more complex political settlement. Porsena did not regain Rome for the Etruscan kings. His army returned to Clusium, and any impositions he had placed on the Roman Republic were soon annulled. And it was not long before the exiled King Tarquin was no longer welcome in Clusium. Whatever the truth, the story provided another exemplar for the male citizens of Rome. These tales directed the behavior and shaped the attitudes of the many citizen soldiers who formed the new republic. Family law and place names on the Roman landscape also preserved and confirmed legends from this heroic past. Like Horatius, Gaius Mucius was said to have been rendered unfit for further military service. He was therefore handed prime farming land next to the Tiber River. This landholding, which later became known as the Mucian Meadows, honored his exceptional action and sacrifice. Mucius provided young Roman men with yet another example of a single individual able to redirect the course of history. There would be many more to come. Indeed, even in this early period, Rome was recognized as an eminent power. The first treaty between Rome and the city-state of Carthage in North Africa was probably agreed soon after the Republic was declared. Polybius had seen ancient bronze tablets inscribed with these treaty arrangements. He records, "I include a translation that is as accurate as I can make it, but the ancient language differs so much from current Latin that even the best Roman scholars have great difficulty interpreting it. The treaty states, 'The Carthaginians shall do no injury to the people of Ardea, Antium, Laurentium, Terracina, nor any other Latins subject to Rome.' This suggests a Roman influence extended up to 60 miles south of the city, and the names of the consuls Brutus and Marcus Horatius were attached to this bronze inscription, which may have been stored in the Capitoline treasury close to the Temple of Jupiter. According to tradition, Rome established a peace treaty with the main Latin cities in the 490s BC, but other rival communities continued to harass and endanger the Republic. An Italic tribe called the Equi occupied a stretch of the Apennine Mountains on the eastern flank of Latium. But perhaps the greatest danger came from the north, where Etruscan cities such as Veii remained powerful rivals. Rome was not safe yet, neither from without or within. The year is 495 BC. An old carpenter sets down his leather sling of chisels and mallets and squats in the dust. He needs a moment to recover his breath, for the people are leaving. From their former homes and workshops, a stream of disillusioned citizens trudge past, heading out of the city. They take their essentials, the tools of their craft or trade businesses with them. Family groups move in a slow, deliberate procession past the old man. They are all abandoning Rome. But his son and daughter-in-law turn back to let his grandchildren rush to the old man's side, urging him to his feet. His son tells him to rouse himself, for the new settlement will need construction workers like them. There will be buildings for shelter and palisades for defense. The tent makers and stonemasons are already ahead of them on the path. Word is spreading, and the noble patricians look on in alarm. The people are deserting the city. But what has happened to divide the Roman citizens and tear through the fabric of the Republican state? The people are plebeians, the mass of citizens who form the busy populace of Rome. They have no high rank or prestigious ancestry, but collectively they have great power and influence through their labor and services. They are the workers, the laborers, the craftsmen, merchants, and farmers, and when the state requires soldiers, it is these unremarkable men who fill the massed ranks of the Roman armies. Early accounts of Rome describe the elite status that noble-born patricians held in their new republic. Their families were generally wealthy and possessed large, productive landed estates near Rome, which financed prosperous urban residences. Their power and prestige were enshrined in the sacred cults and customs of the city. But this wealthy minority also monopolized political power to promote the interests of their own elite. Only candidates from the patrician order could progress through the hierarchy of magistrates and hold one of the two consulships, the supreme political and military offices of state. The supporting offices of tribune were likewise confined to men of distinctive social class. This meant that the Senate, which gained new members from former high magistrates, was exclusively patrician. The governance of the Roman state, the enaction and enforcement of its laws, and even the creation of new legislation was a patrician privilege and monopoly. Of course, this was only tolerated while the patricians maintained and protected the interests of the plebeian population, a growing majority. But warfare had increased the social and political pressures on Roman society, introducing discord and provoking conflict between the classes. In this era, Roman territory was encircled by many rival states and hostile foreign communities. Warfare was therefore continuous, and almost every summer armies were mobilized for vicious territorial campaigns. Military levies kept Roman citizens away from their urban livelihoods, or returned men injured, maimed, or not at all. Many struggling citizens were compelled to take out loans from wealthy patrons, and when they could not repay the amount with interest, the full force of the legal system was used against them. With their punishments approved and authorized by the state, debtors were subjected to beatings or imprisonment. The plebeians agitated for legal reform and debt assistance, but the Senate ignored or rebuffed their appeals. The plebeians were suffering, but how could the masses oppose unfair legal practices and gain effective representation in state affairs? And so, at this crucial juncture, in the Roman Forum, the busy public square where the main business of the city was conducted, an old citizen comes forth. He painfully makes his way through the crowds who part to let him pass by. The interruption is unexpected, but many in the crowd know this man, or at least have fought alongside men like him in the citizen-based armies of Rome. Livy records. An old man suddenly appeared in the forum with proof of the many misfortunes he had suffered. His clothing was covered with filth and his physical form was repellent due to his corpse-like pallor and emaciated frame. His unkempt beard and hair made him look like a wild man. Despite his disfigurement, he was recognized by the pitying bystanders. They said that he had been a centurion who had gained military distinctions. The man bared his chest and showed them the scars he had received in many conflicts when he had fought for Roman honor. By now, the crowd had almost grown to the size of an assembly of the people, and the man was repeatedly asked, "Why are you in tattered clothing? Who caused you this harm?" Onlookers recall the camaraderie of their shared military service, and as the uproar increases, they act in bold unison. If the leaders in Rome abuse and disrespect them, then they will form a new community outside of the city. Men who have engaged in campaigns and formed military encampments know what they must do. Almost spontaneously, the plebeians head back to their homes to gather up what is required and organize their wider families to leave with them. Within hours, the masses are streaming out of the city, heading to Mons Sacer, a sacred hill several miles from Rome. Here, they plan to set up basic defenses and establish their own encampment and community in defiance of patrician Rome. This protest has the momentum of a general strike. The city was rapidly emptied and the center lay abandoned by the masses. All business and labor tasks now ceased in Rome. Shops and workshops closed, and the supply of produce, labor, and resources stopped. Without the plebeians, the depopulated city was an empty shell, without services or protection. The arrogant patricians found themselves isolated and impotent. This action was the first of the secessio plebis, the plebeian secessions, a political weapon using collective action, not violence, to achieve its aims. Rome was surrounded by hostile states, so this withdrawal of military support was a powerful tool. The Senate was forced to act before any enemy could learn of this fracture in Roman society. Envoys arrived at Monsacca offering concessions to induce the plebeians to return to Rome. The plebeians were allowed an assembly to elect senior magistrates who could hold office for an annual term. The new plebeian aedile was granted authority to maintain temples and public buildings, supervise religious festivals and keep civic order. And another new office was created, to be the tribune of the plebs. This was a military title, but the plebeian tribune could advocate and propose legislation on behalf of his social class. He could also veto the actions of other Roman magistrates and was personally sacrosanct, guaranteeing immunity from arrest or physical harm while in office. The plebeians now had a voice. They had secured formal representation in the Roman government and a say in the management of civic affairs. They had their own political champions who could promote and assure plebeian interests against the narrow patrician oligarchy. The new office holders could expect action on issues involving debt, land rights, legal protection, and military service. But the struggle was far from over. "12 bronze tablets are displayed prominently in the Roman Forum. A visitor to the city might think that these are sacred objects. In fine and careful script, the lines of text are sharply inscribed on the bright bronze surface. Perhaps they are religious pledges made by the Roman community, or the revered commands of a god recorded by the temple priests. But if this same visitor stops to ask a passerby, he would be told, these are the laws of Rome. And that same citizen might also add, but they were not won easily. The surviving Roman histories that describe the conflict of the orders were written centuries after the events they record, perhaps shaping these early records into semi-legendary accounts, constructing a narrative from events to reflect their own hopes and fears. After the first succession, it's said that the plebeian tribunes petitioned and pleaded for popular reforms, but their requests were either ignored or dismissed, and rejected on procedural grounds. The abuses continued. Patricians used arbitrary legal procedures against plebeians to uphold the interests and benefits of their own minority class, and so demands were made for the laws to be displayed in public so that all citizens could know and understand their rights. But how was a Roman Bill of Rights to be constructed? According to Livy, the Romans sent envoys to Greece to study the Solonian constitution, the much-admired political and legal system of ancient Athens. Other representatives travelled among the leading Greek city-states of southern Italy or visited the wider Hellenic world to witness and investigate written constitutions that outlined laws and dictated public politics. But the Romans soon realized that radical measures would be required, and so a body of 10 specially appointed legislators was appointed to take full control of the government. They would devise, then set in place the new constitution, and because they were not subject to legal appeal, they could act without any political interference from the Senate. Thus was formed the first decemvirate, a board of 10 men who each held the supreme power of a consul. Within a year, the decemvirate had devised and presented a set of 10 guiding legal codes, but it was agreed that the commission would need another term. Another board was selected by popular agreement, the second decemvirate. But this second committee was different. It was formed from ambitious men who had carefully observed and understood the possibilities offered by this unique office. With mutual support, this new decemvirate clung to power. They procrastinated, obstructed, and finally opposed any attempts to restore the traditional high offices of state and permit popular elections for the senior magistrates. Each Decemviri, with his personal bodyguard of lictors, became a source of dread. The populace no longer had the right to legally protest or appeal the rulings of their political leaders. The Senate itself cowered before the 10. Meanwhile, the dictates of the Decemvirate became increasingly tyrannical, but it was the prospect of violence against an innocent woman that led to their downfall. At least, that is what the legend recalls. It was said that one of the Decemviri, a man named Appius Claudius Crassus, developed a lustful passion for a Roman maiden named Virginia, the daughter of a respected centurion named Lucius Virginius. But Virginia was already betrothed to a former tribune of the plebs, with the full blessing of her father. Appius therefore schemed to bring this young woman under his complete authority. He instructed one of his servants to publicly declare Virginia to be a runaway slave. This accusation was made in public in the crowded Roman Forum. Virginia was wrongly identified and singled out as disputed property. Without citizen rights, she was taken from her family and became the sole possession of a stranger. Then, by using his legal prerogatives, Appius intervened to personally conduct and oversee the case. Witnesses were arranged, and an imminent trial date was set. The urban populace abandoned their shopfronts and surrounded the tribunal area to witness this public trial. Shocked citizens crowded around and watched. They seemed to be helpless spectators in an appalling abuse of state power. Lucius Virginius spoke in defense of his daughter, providing clear testimony that confirmed her citizen status. But the trial was prejudiced, and priority was given to hostile witnesses with fake, invented testimonies. Finally, Appius announced his verdict. He rose to his feet and waited for quiet. The crowd stood still and silent as he spoke. Virginia was indeed a slave, and therefore the misappropriated property of another man. She would spend the rest of her life shut in a hostile household, subject to the whims of a conspiring master. But even more than that, it was now apparent to the people that in future, no record or testimony could protect them. All citizens were now subject to the demands of the 10. Despairing, Lucius Virginius pushes his way forward and asks for a few moments to say a final farewell to his beloved daughter. She is inconsolable as he takes her in his arms. Then, before anyone realizes his intentions, he snatches up a knife and stabs her full in the chest. A mortal wound delivered by an experienced soldier. Death will preserve the dignity of her Roman status, and the lasting honor of her family will remain intact. Cries of shock and horror continue to reverberate through the plebeian crowd as they realize the magnitude of the events that they are witnessing. The uproar grows as the enraged and vindictive Appius commands the immediate seizure and arrest of Virginius. This man has killed a slave, and therefore he has destroyed another man's legal property. The lictors close in upon the grief-stricken figure of Lucius Virginius, still holding the body of his daughter in his arms. But suddenly, the outraged crowd surge forward. In unison and defiance, they surround Virginius to protect and safeguard him. Livy records, "For a long time Virginius could not speak for weeping, but then there was silence and he explained himself. Lifting his hands up to heaven, he appealed to his fellow soldiers and implored them not to blame him for the crime that rightly belonged to Appius. They must not look upon him in horror as the murderer of his children, for he hoped to avenge her death with the aid of his fellow soldiers, since they too had daughters and sisters and wives. And so this was the beginning of the end for the 10. As the plebeians mobilized to begin their second succession from Rome, the unrest and protests spread to the army encamped outside the city. Realizing they had lost control over the populace, the Decemvirate quickly conceded to senatorial demands. They resigned their commissions and reinstated the consuls. The Senate then sent envoys to the plebeian encampment, urging them to return to Rome and promising a greater share of future political power. The former decemvirate now had the status of ordinary citizens, and most of them fled into exile to avoid retaliatory prosecutions or more severe, vengeful measures. But Appius was detained because of his cruelty and blatant misuse of state power. Ironically, he invoked his citizen rights to have a fair legal hearing, but the former magistrate never made it to trial. With the Republic restored, the new legal code demanded by the citizens was finally agreed and enacted. The law of the 12 tables was presented in the forum for all citizens of Rome to see. It was a permanent monument inscribed in bronze that informed each Roman of their civic role and safeguarded essential rights. Much of the text codified and consolidated well-established institutions involving the Roman family, but the most significant passages outlined the legal limitations, actions, and sanctions of the state. They dictated basic procedures for capital offenses and defined serious crimes, including intentional homicide, treason, perjury, judicial corruption, and vicious slander. From now on, it was not just the educated elite who would benefit from detailed knowledge of the state legal system. Every citizen could avoid exploitation by knowing the limitations of the magistrates and could safeguard their own rights and responsibilities within the law. And so the 12 tables formed the core of the Roman legal system. They became an enduring feature of Roman society with a long legacy that extended down through the Republic and even into the legal apparatus of the later empire. Unfortunately, however, the original law codes are no longer in existence. Most passages must be reconstructed from brief excerpts and quotations expressed by later writers. Nevertheless, they were an important development for the Roman state and a leading concept in world history. In the late Republic, the Roman statesman Cicero looked back upon these legal arrangements and concluded, "The short passages that form the 12 tables are the foundation and source of our laws, and it seems to me that they have greater significance and authority than all the libraries of all the philosophers, for they are truly unsurpassed in their abundant utility." The existence of a stable and well-defined legal system reduced political discord and prepared Rome to achieve further power and status across Italy, and then throughout the known world. A solitary, robust figure tends the plough on an impoverished small holding some distance from Rome. The man directs and encourages his 2 powerful oxen on their steady course across the furrowed field. It is tough and demanding work, requiring skill, endurance, and determination. The man is mature in years, but he works with an undiminished focus and energy. At first, he barely acknowledges the richly clothed envoys who approach his farm. But these men carry an urgent message from the highest authorities of the Roman state. One man is required to lead the nation through an emergency, and he is the man who now tends the oxen and steers the plough. Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus. There was one hope for Rome. Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus cultivated a 4-acre field on the other side of the Tiber. After mutual salutations, they requested that he put on his toga to hear the mandate of the Senate. In surprised response, Cincinnatus asked them if all was well and bade his wife, Ricilia, to quickly bring his toga from the cottage. Wiping off the dust and perspiration, he put on the toga and approached them. In that instant, the deputation saluted him as dictator. It is not known for certain how the office of dictator came into being, but the role may have emerged in the first few decades of the new Roman Republic. Sometimes, especially in times of war, one man was required to overrule the political rivalry, bickering, and indecisiveness of the Senate. sometimes it was necessary and desirable for a supreme commander to organize, deploy, and lead the combined forces of Rome and its Latin allies. In these instances, a single serving consul could nominate a worthy man to take up the role of dictator. Often advice would be taken from the Senate, but it was the consul alone who was expected to respond to a crisis by appointing someone who was then granted enhanced state powers. The Roman dictator had supreme, king-like authority, but he was only appointed as a short-term office holder in times of extreme emergency. His political and military powers were almost absolute, but his mandate was restricted to the particular crisis or threat which had required his appointment. Other magistrates continued in office for their assigned year, subordinate only to any specific commands from the dictator related to his causa, his essential mission. It was a complex mix of requirements, but all agreed the office of dictator was essential to the survival and success of the Roman Republic. The ideal dictator was expected to be a savior of the state who could reject the lure of any further power and glory and would quickly leave his empowered position. Indeed, dictators were forbidden to appear before the people of Rome mounted on horseback, to avoid appearing aloof like the arrogant kings of previous eras. And so, in 458 BC, a group of senators left the bustling city of Rome in search of such a man. For Rome needed a dictator. The city was under attack from multiple quarters. Military raids by the Sabines had reached the outskirts of the city, and the Equi, who occupied the Appian Hills east of Rome, threatened even greater destruction. The Roman state was struggling. The consuls had levied 2 armies and marched forth to meet the threat. Consul Minucius encamped near Mount Algidus, hoping to engage the main military force of the Equi, but as night fell, his army had been outmaneuvered, surrounded and blockaded by a superior force. The other consul reviewed the seemingly hopeless situation and despaired. The fate of an entire Roman army was at stake. In the panic that followed, he called upon the Senate to immediately nominate a dictator. And one name was uttered and approved by everyone of merit: Cincinnatus. And so Cincinnatus accepted the summons and headed to Rome to fulfill the sacred rites that would confirm his position as the most powerful man in the state. He set to work immediately, addressing an assembly of the citizens and ordering every man of military age to gather in the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, in an immediate citizen levy. This reinforcement army then undertook a forced march to reach Mount Algidus by nightfall. Once there, they erected their own palisades to place the Equi under a counter-siege. At dawn, the Romans signaled to their besieged comrades, and Cincinnatus ordered an immediate attack. The Equi found themselves assailed from all sides and sought an immediate surrender. Cincinnatus detained their leaders and permitted his men to plunder the enemy camp. Indeed, they made the enemy captives pass under a yoke. This was a bar made from a heavy spear that resembled the yoke that Cincinnatus used to harness his own oxen on the farm. Only by bending low in a symbolic act of submission and defeat were the humiliated prisoners able to pass under the obstacle. Great disaster had been averted with astonishing speed and success, but yet more remarkable were the actions of Cincinnatus in the immediate aftermath. For the dictator did not seek the continuance of power, the accumulation of personal wealth, or even the persecution of his political enemies. His restraint is especially noteworthy because his cherished son Caeso had been exiled for a crime he had not committed years before and had died far from Rome. Caeso's accuser had been publicly denounced and confirmed as a liar, but despite this, Cincinnatus maintained his stern principles of honor and duty and did not seek vengeance. After conducting his triumph, a victory procession through the center of Rome, Cincinnatus promptly disbanded his army and voluntarily resigned his command. Then he quietly returned to the field, where his 2 sturdy oxen were once again made ready on the abandoned furrows. Cincinnatus had held absolute power for barely 16 days. Some say the Cincinnatus presented in the ancient accounts was more of a legend than a historical figure. Perhaps his apparent poverty was a narrative device designed to accentuate his integrity and self-control, but his swift acceptance of state duty despite hardships and harm, and his humble resignation of ultimate authority are powerful motifs. These were the ideals that shaped the behavior of later generations of Romans. In popular stories, he became the exemplar of civic virtue and service for the greater good. His story demonstrated to all how a powerful man must display humility and restraint. In later years, Pliny the Elder marveled at how a former head of state might have labored on his own farmlands. The concept seemed incredible in an era where the Roman elite maintained vast gangs of slaves to tend their vineyards. However, it was said that the young Julius Caesar looked to a different exemplar for his political ambition. Suetonius records, when Julius Caesar was serving as quaestor in further Spain, he visited Cadiz. There he noticed a statue of Alexander the Great in the Temple of Hercules. He sighed heavily to himself, realizing he had done nothing noteworthy in his life when by his age Alexander already dominated the known world. Caesar immediately resigned from his office and sought every opportunity to engage in greater schemes in Rome. Though it would not just be the later Caesars that had a taste for imperial expansion. The year is 396 BC. The Etruscan city of Veii is now a possession of Rome. One of the greatest enemies of the early Roman Republic has been defeated in a relentless and exhausting war. The prolonged and ruthless campaign has ended with complete victory. A rival capital has fallen, the entire territory is in Roman hands, and the populace are at their mercy. Veii was an important Etruscan city situated about 10 miles north of Rome. Just upstream from Roman territories, as far as Rome was concerned, this strategic city was a competitor. Veii grew wealthy from its contacts with other Etruscan cities in the northern part of Italy and vied with Rome for dominance over Latium, the Latin homelands. Tradition records over 3 centuries of intermittent conflict and occasional alliance between the rival cities of Veii and Rome. It was even said that Romulus and his Sabine allies defeated an army from Veii on the battlefield, and similar feats were attributed to other previous rulers of Rome. By the Republican era, Veii still remained a peripheral threat and a focus for further military action. Veii also rivaled Rome in terms of political prestige and in the status of its ancient cults. The city boasted a monumental temple dedicated to Juno, a major goddess in both the Latin and Etruscan pantheons. Juno was a martial deity, a protector and special counselor to ancient cities. Her favor was a symbol of authority and a prize to be contested. And so, in 406 BC, Rome declared war against Veii. But victory on the battlefield and the occupation of new territory was no longer sufficient, because Rome was now committed to the full-scale destruction of its ancient rival. Like the legendary siege of Troy, Roman writers describe a struggle for victory that lasted a decade. Finally, a dictator was chosen to oversee the Latin allies and ensure a swift and complete victory for Rome. That man was Marcus Furius Camillus, a commander who would be hailed by later Roman writers as the second founder of Rome. The urban stronghold at Veii was constructed on a volcanic rock plateau. It seems Camillus observed the porous texture of the rock and realized that Roman sappers could tunnel deep beneath the city. Unseen by the enemy, the concealed Roman workers burrowed into the volcanic stone until they broke into the underground channels that carried water and sewage beneath the streets. It was said that Camillus ordered a sudden Roman attack on the walls to draw the armed citizens away from the inner city. This created a cacophony of noise that covered the subterranean approach of armed men. Meanwhile, the real Roman assault force was creeping through the underground passages to reach the sewer system beneath the main temple. And in the temple of Juno, the priest was reading the auguries. At that very moment, they were performing a sacrifice. The priest looked into the entrails of the creature and cried out with a loud voice that the gods would give victory to those who would complete the offerings. But the Romans in the mines, hearing these words, immediately pulled down the floor. They ascended with a battle cry and clashing weapons, frightening away the enemy. They snatched up the sacrificial entrails and carried them straight away to Camillus. This might seem a fable, but the city was certainly stormed. And the Romans were uninterested in surrender. The soldiers slaughtered the adult male population, and all women and children were declared slaves. The plunder stripped from houses and public buildings was unprecedented, but the temples of the gods were spared. Camillus also promised that a large part of the plunder would be gifted to the shrines at Delphi in central Greece. It was said that the victorious general Camillus entered the famed temple of the goddess Juno and personally addressed her statue. Displaying the greatest reverence, he humbly asked if the goddess now present in that sanctuary would come to Rome and take up residence on the Capitoline Hill. And in later centuries, many other gods would follow Juno to Rome as the Republic and then the Empire spread its military power and cultural influence across the ancient world. Perhaps, of course, these Roman accounts of Veii and its destruction were partly inspired by the legendary sack of Troy, and later Roman writers created a narrative that emulated the greatest of Greek legends. Or maybe the early Romans themselves were inspired by Homer's epic, replicating the ruthless tactics they admired in the archaic Greek accounts. Indeed, modern archaeologists have found long drainage passages cut into the soft rock deep beneath the site of ancient Veii. But what would the Roman Republic do with a second city? Any decisions taken would have long-term consequences because Rome was destined to capture many other ancient cities in its ascent to world domination. Radical proposals were made to relocate half the populace of Rome to Veii. This would ease the worsening issues of overpopulation, poverty, and the increasing political agitation of the plebeians. But it would also fracture the Roman community and split the close connections of kinship and shared society founded by Romulus. Plutarch describes the dilemma. The tribunes proposed a way to divide the people in the Senate into two parts. A numerous mass of impoverished people were delighted by this proposal. They continually thronged about the rostra, loudly demanding that this project be put to the vote. But the Senate and other influential citizens thought that this proposal by the tribunes meant not just the division of Rome, but also its destruction. Camillus supported the patricians in opposing the scheme. To distract the populace, they mobilized Rome for a large-scale war against another Italic community. But when victory was achieved there, Camillus prevented his troops from sacking the surrendered city. There was an uproar. Menaced by mounting political pressures, Camillus decided to remove himself from the legal and political processes of the city, and so that his family would not be presented with crippling fines, he accepted political exile and left Rome. But it was said that his final moments in the city resembled the fate of Achilles in the first book of the Iliad. For when that Greek champion was deprived of his battle prize by his own community, he called upon the gods to avenge him. Camillus kissed his wife and son goodbye. Then he went from his household in silence as far as the city gate. There, he paused, turned around, and stretching out his hands towards the capital, he uttered a prayer to the gods. He was being driven from his country against the will of justice. He prayed that the Romans might quickly repent and realize how greatly they needed him. Then, like Achilles, he called down curses upon his fellow citizens as he departed his home. another former dictator removed themselves from the political squabbles of this turbulent city. But Camillus's prayers for crisis would be well heeded by the gods. For far to the north, in the lands that the Greeks called Hyperborea, there were distant stirrings of hostile people. Rome was about to face an unprecedented threat that would bring it to the edge of utter destruction and define the burgeoning state for centuries to come. The Celts were coming. The city is a hazy blur of still smouldering devastation. Ransacked homes and state buildings have toppled and collapsed in the firestorm, leaving a thick ash sediment on the paved surfaces. The slightest breeze casts up swirling eddies of acrid, choking particles. Here and there, Celtic headhunters display skulls as grisly trophies, strange offerings to their alien gods. The unmistakable stench of death and decay fills the oppressive air as the full heat of the Italian summer begins to dissolve the morning chill. And Gaius Fabius Dorsuo marches onwards, without weapons or protection. He strides forward, dwarfed by the towering figures of the muscular Celts. Any moment now, this vulnerable Roman will be slammed down by an ornate shield or gashed by an oversized sword. Or will the Celts crowd in and batter him with their brutal fists? Will this Roman be dragged half-dead through the debris-strewn streets in full sight of his appalled comrades stationed on the high Capitoline defenses? The route to his sacred destination is familiar, but the conditions are not. And yet with steady, deliberate movements, Dorsuo never deviates. Unchallenged and unscathed, he ascends the Quirinal Hill, and once there, he begins the ritual. It is a symbolic act, perhaps even now futile, in a city that may have no future. To the Romans, the Celts were a ferocious and enigmatic people dominating lands to the north. Their societies were tribal, and their cultures emphasized heroic warfare. Their distinctive art styles and strange gods were confusing and alarming to Mediterranean peoples, and there was also an ethnic component to this distrust. The Celts of southern Europe spoke languages and had physical traits that marked them out as different. The first Celtic tribes may have crossed into northern Italy in around 600 BC, but further surges of Celtic migration from Gaul expanded their influence down the Po Valley into the core Etruscan territories. In desperation, the city of Clusium appealed for Roman assistance, but when an ambassador of Rome slew a Celtic warlord, the dispute led to war. The Celts marched south with astonishing speed, and at the Battle of Alia, they vanquished the army of Rome. This Celtic horde of strange northern warriors could not be stopped. A few soldiers managed to rush back from the battlefield to announce the annihilation of their kinsmen. Death is coming. The city will fall. Indeed, the Celtic victory at the Battle of Alia was so bloody, brutal, and complete that the hostile hordes arriving to attack Rome had halted in astonished puzzlement at the city walls. The defeated Roman army had fled. The city was undefended and the gates lay wide open to the invaders. But the Celts hesitated. Had their easy victory on the far side of the Tiber been a ruse? Was the sudden Roman rout an elaborate trap? But within the undefended city, there was nothing but unrestrained terror and turmoil. Stirred by sudden panic, a great mass of ordinary people begin salvaging whatever possessions they can. They collect their families together and surge out of the city gates furthest from the approaching enemy. They are now refugees who will lose their identity in the great mass of other Latin communities. Their traditions will fade now that their home city is lost to a savage new enemy. But meanwhile, some of the leading citizens convince remnants of the army to make a final stand in the most sacred part of Rome, the high ground on the Capitoline Hill. A small group of survivors will take refuge within this makeshift citadel. There, among the most revered of their ancient buildings and the most sacred temples of their gods, the last Romans prepare to make their stand. Behind the defenses, the remaining officers of patrician rank form themselves into a makeshift senate, with the soldiers serving as the citizen assembly. Those who are elderly, infirm, or ill cannot join the defenders on the besieged hill, for they will be a burden, and so weak citizens willingly stand aside, knowing that they sacrifice themselves for a Roman future they will never see. A few old or infirm Romans remain defiantly in their houses and homesteads. They sit under their porticos, dressed in ceremonial or state togas, and await certain death. The Celts eventually swarmed through the unmanned gates of Rome, rushing through the city, indiscriminately killing in their search for plunder. The dying cries of the old men, still defiant, could be heard from the Capitoline. Night after night, the defenders had watched from the citadel, the final refuge and hope for Rome. Carrying the sacred vessels in his hands, Gaius Fabius Dorsuo walked down from the Capitol Hill. He passed through the middle of the enemy blockade, ignoring all challenges or threats issued by the Gallic warriors. Unchallenged and unscathed, he ascends the Quirinal Hill. When Dorsuo reached the Quirinal Hill, he duly performed all the solemn rites required by the custom. Then he turned and walked back up to the citadel with the same composed expression and resolute pace. Finally, Dorsuo re-entered the capital and rejoined his comrades. Maybe the Gauls were stupefied by his extraordinary boldness, or maybe they were too restrained by religious sentiments. This single act of defiance reassured the defenders sealed inside the sacred precincts of the old citadel. Rome might be preserved, as long as the defenders honored their gods, upheld their customs, and revered their ancestors. Slowly, one by one, the stars come out. As the twilight deepens into night, Pontius Cominius moves stealthily through the undergrowth of the riverbank and slips into the cold waters of the river Tiber. He's not wearing any armor and does not carry any significant weaponry. He clutches a simple cork float to his chest to keep his head above the deeper waters. All he is carrying is a message, as the Tiber River takes him down to the occupied and surrounded city of Rome. He must reach Rome, creep inland, evade enemy blockades, and pass unnoticed through the devastated city. Floating on the dark waters, Cominius recalls how brave Horatius entrusted his life to Father Tiber. He takes courage from the story of Mucius, who scorned physical injury to pursue his duty. The outcome of the war depends entirely on his actions, and he risks capture and torture by a fearsome enemy. Indeed, it is rumored that the Celts sacrifice living men to their strange gods in horrific fire ceremonies. But the message Cominius carries to the Senate is of extraordinary importance. He must not fail. Cominius brings an astonishing message. Still in the hours of darkness, by torchlight, the makeshift Senate is rapidly convened. Cominius tells the Senate that the Roman army was not obliterated in the Celtic victory at Alia. Large numbers of Roman soldiers escaped to regroup, reorganize, and gather allies from surrounding Italian communities. Marcus Camillus has joined them at Veii and will assume supreme command of the growing army. There is hope. Camillus can rally the army, rescue the defenders, and restore the city-state. As a skilled general, he will lead resurgent forces to reclaim their home city. But first, he must be granted the title of dictator by the Senate and the soldier citizens in Rome. The fragmented Roman community must honor their gods and follow their ancestral ways if the city is to be saved. The Senate decides the issue without contention. A decree is issued, and the office of dictator is granted. Before sunrise, Pontius Cominius retraces his steps and silently returns to the river, and his actions will be immortalized in Roman history. Although this brave man is just a plebeian, his descendants, the gens Pontia, will survive and prosper. After Rome has extended its imperial rule across the Mediterranean, one of his descendants, named Pontius Pilate, is destined to become the governor of distant Judea. It is dawn. The slumbering Roman sentries on Capitoline Hill are dreaming of the victory to come. But disturbed vegetation from Cominius leaving now indicates a hidden route up the cliff. Skilled Celtic trackers notice that the course to the summit is clearly visible, but they wait. The following night, before moonrise, the Celtic warriors begin their quiet ascent in the darkness. They climb, silently assisting one another, passing weapons up to colleagues who reach secure ledges on the rough cliff face. High above them, not even the watchdogs stir. But the gods are watching. Livy records. The Gauls had noticed the footprints left by the messenger from Veii, or maybe they had discovered their own route up the cliff face to the Temple of Carmentis. They ascended, passing their weapons between climbers where the route was difficult. Finally, they reached the summit. The Celts were so stealthy and silent that the Roman sentinels did not notice. But on the summit, the Temple of Juno lies close to the precipice. The sacred geese of her cult have not been consumed, despite the extreme hunger and hardship faced by the garrison. Her statues and trophies had been transferred from Veii when the Romans captured the city. Indeed, Camillus himself had spoken directly to the goddess, inviting her to transfer her divine presence and become the protectress of Rome. And so, in the darkness, the sacred geese are suddenly disturbed. There is a violent flapping of wings and angry hoots of distress and alarm. One figure is immediately alert at the sound, a Roman officer named Marcus Manlius. He wakes to see the first shadowy forms of the enemy sliding over the rocky parapet and gathering on the summit. Manlius has only moments to take action. The fate of a city and a nation, once again, lies with one man. Livy records. He snatched up his weapons and immediately called his comrades to arms. A Gaul had already reached the summit and stood ready to fight, with others scrambling up to take position behind him. Manlius charged the leader, struck him with the boss of his shield and knocked him down the cliff face. The group that had gathered behind him had set aside their weapons to reach the summit. Manlius leapt into them and sent them staggering. The closest climbers were still clinging to the rock face with their bare hands. But other Roman soldiers had joined the fray, and they began to hurl stones and javelins down upon the enemy to dislodge them from the cliff face. Rome had once again been saved by the immediate action of a single heroic individual. But only for now. The following days became more and more desperate. Then, since those in authority thought it best, Sulpicius, the military tribune of the Romans, held a conference with the Celtic war chief Brennus, and it was agreed that on the delivery of 1,000 pounds of gold by the Romans, the Gauls should straightway depart out of the city and the country. Oaths were sworn to these terms, and the gold was brought to be weighed. But the Gauls tampered with the scales. Secretly at first, then they openly pulled the balance back out of its poise. The Romans were incensed at this, but Brennus, with a mocking laugh, stripped off his sword and added it, belt and all, to the weights. When Sulpicius asked, "What means this?" "What else?" said Brennus. "Woe to the conquered." Vi Victis were the words of the Celtic war chief Brennus as he cast his heavy sword onto the weighing scales. Roman officers, now gaunt and haggard, sent to negotiate peace terms and pay a ransom, watched in dismay. They had no further recourse to argue. Camillus had not arrived as expected to expel the invaders, and the garrison in the besieged capital were experiencing starvation. Where was the dictator and the army that would rescue Rome? And then finally, Camillus came. His formidable army had been formed from Roman soldiers who had fled the previous battle and from garrison troops in surrounding towns and cities, including Veii. The former runaways are eager to reclaim their honor, while their colleagues are seeking revenge. The army is also enlarged and strengthened by numerous Italian allies who have also pledged to fight for Rome. Camillus spoke. "Tell Brennus that the dictator has come. The Gauls must fight or flee. No ransom is due, for I did not agree to it." The Roman relief force prepared for immediate battle. Livy records, Camillus ordered his men to pile their baggage into heaps and to get their weapons ready immediately. But when the Gauls realized what was occurring, they suddenly became alarmed and seized their weapons. Filled with rage, they rushed at the Romans, but they fought without method or planning. The goddess Fortuna had shifted her focus. Fate now favored the Romans. The dictator Camillus had recovered his country from the enemy. Now he returned victorious to Rome to receive the genuine praise of the soldiers. They called out in public, naming him a new Romulus, the father of his country, and the second founder of the city. But during the 7-month siege, the city had been utterly destroyed. The emaciated figures that emerged from the Capitoline Hill gave testimony to the wretched humiliations suffered by survivors. Pitiful glances were exchanged before the liberated soldiers embraced their kinsmen and wept. What now remains of their once great city? The people are dejected and despair. The destruction is too complete for the Romans to rebuild. Surely the city ends here. But news of the Roman victory quickly reached neighboring towns and cities. In response, a vast number of refugees headed homeward to salvage whatever might remain of their former lives. They set up tents and shelters on the outskirts of the city, and from these makeshift encampments, they waited to reclaim their former properties and possessions. Some of the first people admitted into the ruins were priests and temple attendants. The returning Vestal virgins rekindled the consecrated flame of their goddess, and the sanctuary at the center of Rome once more shone with the glow of the sacred hearth fire. But Livy records, the temple sites were at last cleared of debris, but this was an arduous undertaking, and the city now had to be rebuilt from a state of utter destruction. The multitude were overwhelmed with despair at the task and withdrew from the prospect. They lacked everything required and sought rest and calm after their many sufferings. They did not want to engage in exhausting labor on a task they didn't have the means or the strength to complete. And so, their thoughts turned to Veii, a city which remained intact and was equipped with all the infrastructure they required. Agitators in the crowd began giving speeches against Camillus, increasing the misery of the people and encouraging popular discontent. They said that Camillus thought only of his own ambition and fame. He would deprive the Romans of Veii, a city that was ready to receive them. He was forcing the Romans to pitch their tents and find shelter among a mass of ruins. The senators gave impassioned speeches in the public assemblies, but the helpless multitude begged that they should be freed of their responsibility. Why try to piece together the shattered fragments of their ancestral city when they could have new homes and livelihoods in Veii? And so, retaining his powers as the supreme commander, Camillus decided that the issue should be settled in a council debate. But the council seemed divided. The consular tribune, Lucius Lucretius, was offered the opportunity to cast the first vote, a vote that could sway the entire Senate. But Lucretius suddenly hesitated. Livy records, tradition gave Lucretius the first vote and required that he declare his opinion before the other senators who would vote in due order. But as silence fell, Lucretius hesitated. In that moment, it happened that a centurion with a squad of soldiers from the day watch was passing by the outside of the building. Suddenly, the officer called out orders in a loud voice to his standard-bearer. He commanded him to halt. He called out to place the standards there as the best place to settle and remain. This utterance was heard by the Senate in the very moment of anxious crisis as they considered their uncertain future. Suddenly, Lucretius declared that he cast his vote with the gods, and the rest of the senators, one by one, followed his example. It seems that the gods had spoken through a citizen soldier. Rome would remain on its ancestral grounds. But was Livy accurate when he retold these traditions about the sack of Rome by the Celts? Archaeologists excavating ancient Rome cannot find a large-scale layer of distinctive burnt debris dating to this time. Perhaps the sack and occupation of Rome did not occur on the grand destructive scale suggested by the earliest traditions. Perhaps the narratives were enhanced by the myth of Troy, or the vast, destructive measures the later Roman Republic would itself inflict on Syracuse, Carthage, and Corinth. But the terror inspired by the Celts was genuine, and centuries later, Julius Caesar harnessed these fears to justify the expansion of Roman dominions into Gaul and northern Europe. The requirements of Caesar's war in terms of manpower and military command would undo the Republic and once again place one man in sole charge of the state. And it would be his nephew, Octavius, who became known as Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. "13 years after the capture of Rome, the aged Marcus Furius Camillus commands the army once more. The Celts have assembled and are marching south into the lands under Roman protection. But this time, the Romans are ready. Their helmets are reinforced to deflect powerful downward sword strikes, and they have trained in the use of javelins to thrust underneath the falling strike of long enemy swords. But most of all, they've prepared themselves to withstand the psychological shock of a physically powerful enemy charging with terrifying fury into their ranks. They know they are outnumbered, but if they can withstand the initial onslaught, then their superior discipline will bring them victory. Camillus is now almost 80 years old, but he accepts the title of dictator for the 5th and final time. He is fully confident that Rome will succeed against all invaders." Writing during the reign of the first Emperor Augustus, Livy casts his mind back to the 4th century BC, and the era after Rome was restored. It took the Roman state almost a century to defeat and subjugate the Celts who occupied northern Italy. This was the century when Macedonia gained power over Greece, and Alexander the Great led his armies east to conquer the vast Persian Empire. Livy therefore pauses in his consideration of Roman history to engage in some informed speculation on what might have been. He considers what qualities Rome needed to prepare for its ultimate destiny. He confesses, "I have often silently pondered in my mind, how would the Romans have fared in a war against Alexander? For in a war, the main factors, the military manpower, the valor of the soldiers, the abilities of the commanders, and the dictates of fortune." And so Livy expresses the first great what if of history. What if Alexander the Great had marched west in the 330s or the 320s BC? Could his world-conquering army have subdued or subjugated Rome? In answer, Livy considers what set Rome apart from rival powers. He argues, "Our early commanders had courage and abilities equal to Alexander, but they also possessed professional military training passed down from the very beginnings of Rome. These military principles came from our warring kings, from the men who expelled them, and from every subsequent commander thereafter. Furthermore, the men who would have fought Alexander had seen in their youth and held as their examples commanders such as Furius Camillus, Alexander would have fought men who were famous as skilled soldiers before they became military statesmen. And how could the decision of a single young king have possibly outperformed the Roman Senate, formed as it was by such extraordinary individuals? According to Livy, this was the energy and impetus that propelled the fate of Rome. Of course, the first Greek writers to consider this issue might have agreed with this analysis. Polybius described the vicious wars that the Roman army fought to protect their territory and subdue the powerful Celtic tribes that occupied northern Italy. In his view, this enemy had prepared them for war against the Greeks and Carthaginians. He writes, "The Romans gained great advantages from these military struggles against the Gauls. Firstly, they became accustomed to the mass slaughter that such an enemy could inflict. This was the most terrible experience that any army could expect to deal with in a conflict. Consequently, the Romans were already well-trained athletes in war by the time they encountered King Pyrrhus in battle." But the destruction of Rome by the Celts had another impact on the city and its citizens. Their material past had been obliterated, and so the Romans reshaped their origin myths and legends to suit their altered requirements. The early history of the Romans was explained and shaped by legend. Their ancient community was informed by myths that upheld the martial values of noble heroes and stories that emphasized citizens' rights. These narratives also venerated the ideals of honorable men and the responsibilities of high office. But it was also a society driven by class conflict, as plebeians competed with patricians for political influence. The Romans had a state system committed to continuous warfare with the appointment of powerful and ambitious leaders. These men might never obtain the authority of kings or tyrants, but they were nonetheless bound by ancient legend and revered traditions. And so, some say that these early histories of Rome represent the concerns of later Roman writers, transferred into their distant past. And that may be so, but these traditions and narratives were also ingrained in the character and actions of the ancient Romans and the empire they created. You've been watching Voices of the Past. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Check it out for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox, and use my link in the pinned comment or video description to claim your free bonus, available for new and returning players who come back after 6 months. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.